everyone. Thanks for coming to hang out with me today. If you're new here, my name's Jess. If you caught my last DIY video, you may have seen that I shared with you my dirty little secret of collecting wooden pieces from the Dollar Tree. What you might not have seen in one of those totes at the very bottom was a stack of wood rounds. So today, I'm taking 6 of those wood rounds and I'm creating 5 projects with them. I'm really excited to share these with you. I hope you are too. Let's get started. With Easter around the corner, I wanted to use one of my wood rounds to create an Easter sign. I grabbed one of these wooden wreath forms from the Dollar Tree, a little bunny pick, some ribbon, and a couple spring florals as well. I started by giving my wood round a quick coat of antique wax. I applied it with a baby wipe. I always like to do this because the wet wipes do 2 things. They apply the wax and they also take off the excess. After I had applied all of the wax to the front of the wood round, I bumped my jar and dumped it all over it again. So I poured what I could back into the jar, I dumped the excess back out onto my work surface, and I stained the back too. You probably don't have to stain both sides, but since I kind of made a boo-boo and got wax everywhere, I went ahead and just did both sides of mine. I didn't stain the beads that were on the wreath form because I wanted a nice contrast between the beads and the wood round. I wanted to decorate it up a bit, so I grabbed some pastel colored ribbon. I folded it into a loop until I liked the width of it. I cinched it in the center and tied it with some jute twine. Once that was in place, I took another small piece of the same ribbon, folded it into thirds, and glued it around the center to give it a finished look. I didn't care for the little bow that was on the bottom of the bunny pick, so I pulled that off and I grabbed some pink gingham ribbon out of my stash. I cut a small piece and I just tied a knot in the center. After I dovetailed the ends, it looked like a bow tie, and I used a little hot glue to glue that onto the bottom of my bunny. Before hot gluing my bunny to the center of my bow, I added a few florals on the back side so that it would look like it was sticking out from behind the bunny. Once I had those florals in place, then I hot glued the bunny to the center of the bow, and I grabbed a couple more little spring type picks and tucked those in around the bunny as well. Then the last step I needed to do was just hot glue the bow and the bunny to the bottom of the wooden bead wreath form. Before I attached my wooden bead wreath form to the wood round, I grabbed another piece of that same ribbon and I looped it through the top of the wood bead wreath, and I cinched it together towards the top and tied it in place with some jute string. I dovetailed the ends so that they would have some fun points on them. And then, rather than stressing myself out with trying to center the wood bead wreath into the center of the wood round, I glued it to the top of the wood round, leaving about an inch gap at the top and a little bit of a bigger space on the bottom. To make sure that the wreath form would stay secure on the wood round, I added a bit of hot glue on some of the bottom beads and stuck it to the wood round. Now, I think this looks cute just as it is, but if you wanted a few alternatives, I had this letter M in my stash, which is what my last name starts with, and I also have a Cricut, so I decided to cut a decal out with my Cricut that says Happy Easter, and I just applied that to the gap in the center. But like I said, I think it looks cute without anything in it. This just gives it a little extra embellishment. I've had these 2 winter tags in my stash for a while, and I figured they would look really good layered on a wood round. Now this one's from the Dollar Tree, so it's a little bit smaller than the other ones, but it still works for a great sign. I started by giving the wood round a base coat of white chalk paint. Then I moved on to the 2 tags. I gave one a base coat of some teal colored paint, and the other one I had to give 2 coats of yellow chalk paint. After my paint was dry, I started creating stripes on the wood round. I'm using painter's tape. I laid a piece down, then I laid a smaller piece down to act as a spacer, and then I placed my next piece of painter's tape. I did this the whole way across until I had stripes going across the surface of the wood round. Once all of my tape was in place, I went back in with that same teal color that I painted the tag with, and I did a heavy dry brushing all over the surface to create some distressed looking stripes. I wanted to create smaller stripes in between the bigger ones, so I'm using some thinner washi tape. After my stripes were good and dry, I placed the washi tape on either side of the stripes to create a smaller center stripe. Once all of the tape was in place, then I went through with the yellow color that I painted on the other tag, and I painted my second set of stripes. On the teal tag, I wanted to create some polka dots, so I'm using a pencil eraser dipped in some white chalk paint, and I just started placing larger polka dots all over the tag. Once I had all of the larger polka dots in place, I went back through with a dotting tool, and I dipped it in the same white paint and created smaller polka dots in between the larger ones. To add a bit of texture to the yellow tag, I'm using a stencil brush or a chippy brush, and I'm just dipping it in some white chalk paint and dry brushing it all over the edges to give it a distressed look. Also on the yellow tag, I created a decal using my Cricut with a little birdhouse that says welcome, and applied that to the front of the tag. There were already 2 holes at the top of this wood round, which I'm going to use as the hanger for my sign. I added a bit of hot glue to the end of a piece of jute cord, fished it through, and tied a knot on the front of the sign. Then I did the same thing on the other end of the jute cord, and I strung on a few of these black wooden beads that I had in my stash because I thought the black beads would coordinate well with the black decal that I added to the front of the yellow tag. Once I had all of the beads on the jute string, then I just had to run the other end of the jute through the other hole at the top, tie another knot, and cut off the excess. I didn't like that you could still see the holes at the top of my tags, so I grabbed some black ribbon out of my stash. I cut a small piece, tied a knot in the center, dovetailed the ends to create that faux bow tie look that I love so much, and I hot glued a little bow tie to the top of each tag. I layered one tag on top of the other and fastened them together using some hot glue. Then I flipped both tags over, and I cut a few pieces of craft stick to fill in the gap where the one tag was on top of the other, so that when I went to attach them to the wood round, it would be a nice flat surface to glue them onto. To complete this sign, I added a generous amount of hot glue to the back of the 2 tags, and then I placed it in the center of the wood round. In addition to the wood round for this project, I'm going to use one of the thicker wooden dowels from Walmart, one of these adhesive cork sheets from the Dollar Tree, a roll of the faux leather, one of the mini chalkboards, and a little magnetic notepad. I started by giving the thicker wood dowel and the wood round itself one really good coat of white chalk paint. In case you couldn't tell by the items I'm using for this project, I'm going to create a command center. So for the adhesive cork sheet that you can get at the Dollar Tree, these come in really handy, but they are rather thin. I wanted to create a mini cork board for on my command center. I'm using this large jar of Mod Podge as my pattern for my circle, and I ended up tracing out 4 circles, but I only needed 3. So once I had all of my circles traced onto the cork sheet, I cut them out, and because they are adhesive on the back, I was able to just layer them on top of each other to create a nice thick cork base for my mini cork board. There were a few places where there was an edge of one of the cork sheets sticking out from the other one, so I just trimmed that off with my scissors. Then, to give it a nice finished look and to cover up the raw edges of the cork, I just used some hot glue and glued some nautical rope all around the outside of my mini cork board. Another element to my command center that I wanted to create was a hanging pocket. I started by unrolling the roll of faux leather from the Dollar Tree. I laid it out, and on the longest side, I cut 2 inches in width off the entire length of the roll. With the wrong side facing up, I laid my ruler down and I pointed to the 5-inch mark, because what I'm going to do is run a bead of hot glue along the one end of the faux leather. I'm going to fold it over till the end lines up with that 5-inch mark, and this is going to create a channel so that I have a place to put that dowel rod that I painted white. I folded the other end up until it overlapped just a bit on the other side. I gave it a small press with my fingers. You can't really see it on camera, but it does create a line there, so I know where to apply my glue to. and I ran hot glue along both sides up until that crease mark that I had created, and then I folded it back over and pressed the hot glue down and held everything into place. Now if you have a sewing machine, obviously you could just sew this pocket, but I don't have a sewing machine, so I rely on my hot glue. To create the hanging tabs at the top of my pocket, I'm using my ruler. I measured in 1 inch from each end and I cut a slit about 1 inch down. I double checked to make sure that I had 1 inch cut on each end. Then I used my rotary cutter and I just sliced out that section that I had cut so that it created a hanging loop on each side of my pocket. And you can see here that the dowel rod slips right through both of those tabs. Now with the piece that I had cut out of the pocket, I'm taking that and I'm cutting it down into 2 1-inch wide strips, and this is what I'm going to use to actually attach the dowel rod to the wood round. I took those 2 strips and I slipped them around the wood dowel on the inside of the 2 hanging tabs from the pocket. I added a bit of hot glue towards the top and I glued the 2 ends together. These are the 2 pieces that I'm going to use to attach to the wood round, and this serves 2 purposes. 1, it connects the pocket to the wood round, and 2, it'll keep that pocket and dowel rod in place so that they don't slip off. After I glued both tabs to the back of the wood round, I just held them in place and gave them a little extra security with some clear tape. Back to the front of the command center, I laid everything out how I liked it. I did cut one other leather piece that was slightly wider than the notepad, and where I had the notepad placed, I just added a bit of hot glue to each side of the notepad. That way I could stick the backer for the notepad, you know, the little cardboard piece that's on the back. I could just slide that right through and it would hold that in place. I did this so that when I run out of paper on the notepad, rather than having the notepad actually glued to the command center, I can just slip that back out and change it with a different notepad. Next, I moved on to my mini cork board. I pulled off the adhesive backer, but for a little extra security, I did add some hot glue and I stuck that right on top of my mini notepad. After that was in place, then I added hot glue to the back of the mini chalkboard, and you can see I decided to add it vertical on my command center because it just fit better, and I pressed that down in place also. I still had a small strip of leather left, and I needed to create places where I could hold pens, markers, or a piece of chalk, which I didn't have on hand. I thought I had some chalk, but I didn't, so I'm just using Sharpies for this example. I took that leather piece, I wrapped it around the Sharpie so that I knew what my length would needed to be. I cut the piece, and then I used some hot glue to hot glue the 2 ends together to create a tunnel to hold the Sharpie. I created 2 of these little tunnels because I knew eventually I would get a piece of chalk to put in there, and I also did need a Sharpie so that I could write on the notepad. So just using hot glue, I attached both of the little tunnels, one to the bottom and one towards the top of the chalkboard. This command center can be decorated any way that you like. I decided to keep mine pretty simple. I created a decal using my Cricut with just the initial for our last name. I added that to the pocket. And then for my chalkboard, we like to meal plan in our house, so we always have a menu posted for the week as to what we're eating for dinner. So I did cut out the word menu with my Cricut and I added that to the top of my chalkboard. Now I've used these mini chalkboards before and other things, and they do work well, but one thing I recommend is before you start writing on it, take a piece of chalk and color in the whole surface of the chalkboard first with chalk and wipe it all off, and that sort of primes it so that it's easier to write on. You could use one of those sawtooth hangers on the back of this wood round to be able to hang it, but I didn't have any of those on hand, so I'm just using some regular nautical rope. I have my ruler laid out so that I could space it evenly, and like I always like to do, I added hot glue and then clear tape over it for extra security. If you've been crafting with me for a while, you probably noticed that I love to create wall pockets. So I thought, why not make one out of a wood round? I took one wood round and one of the carpets that you can find at the Dollar Tree. I wouldn't really say these are carpets. They're pretty small, but they're great for crafts, and they do come in different colors. I started by giving my wood round one coat of white chalk paint. On the long side of the carpet, it's rolled over and hemmed into place, which makes it great for this craft because it's already finished. I laid the carpet over top of the wood round, a little over halfway up from the bottom, and then I held it in place with some painter's tape so that it would stay where I wanted it to while I flipped it over. I lifted the carpet up and exposed the bottom half of it so that I could run a bead of hot glue along the bottom. Then I flipped the carpet back down over and pressed it into place along the bottom. Once my glue was all set up, I flipped the whole thing over and I took my scissors and I cut about 1.5 inches to 2 inches away from the wood round so that I had a nice piece of carpet left over to work with. Starting at the top of each side where that rolled hem is, I hot glued those into place first because they are the thickest pieces of material on the back side, and I wanted to make sure those were secure before moving on. So once I had both of those glued down and they were secure, then I started adding hot glue around the bottom and just bunching the material up and bringing it up in small sections until I had all of the material glued into place on the back. Now, I wouldn't recommend using a staple gun for this because these wood rounds are pretty thin and I would be afraid that the staples would end up coming out through the front. So I would just stick with hot glue for this. When I'm using hot glue and fabric, I always like to make sure that the glue has completely cooled down before I move on. So once my glue was all set up, then I went through and cut off some of the excess material from the back. I wanted to add some embellishments to the front of my pocket, and since this carpet already had fringy pieces tied onto both ends, I decided to take advantage of that and I cut each of the ends off. And because of the pattern on this carpet, those diamond shapes really made it easy because I was able to cut a straight line because I just kept my scissors in the same part of the diamond the whole way down. Back on the front of the pocket now, I ran a bead of hot glue along the top and I laid my first piece of fringe material across the top. Once that was set into place, then I flipped all of the fringes up and I laid the second piece underneath it, and I tried to make sure that the fringes were staggered so that the bottom row would stick out in between the top row of fringes. I finished off the sides by cutting off a bit of the excess and just hot gluing it towards the back. I needed to be able to hang this pocket, so I'm using my Crop-A-Dile tool. I'll have this linked in the description box. I love this because it cuts through most thicker materials, especially thinner wood like this. I used it and I just punched a hole at the top the same way you would use a paper hole punch. Next, to make a decorative hanger for my wood pocket, I took a length of jute twine. I added a bit of hot glue to the two ends and rolled them together so that it would make it easier to fish through the hole at the top. I put the two ends in first and pulled it through the other end to create a slip knot. Then I strung on a few wooden beads and tied a knot at the top, and this was going to be my hanger. You can fill your pocket up with whatever you'd like. I just gathered up some of my favorite pieces of greenery and a few neutral flowers and tucked them in. I don't know about you, but when I have a candle in a pretty container, after I burn the candle, I like to keep the container and reuse it. So in addition to this candle container, I'm using 2 wood rounds, some of these giant craft sticks from Walmart, and some nautical rope. Now you can see these wood rounds. In one direction, they're super flexible, and in the other direction, they're pretty stiff. So I wanted to make sure that this was really sturdy because I am going to be using this as a riser. So on the flexible side, I took these giant craft sticks and I started hot gluing them across the wood grain because that's usually where it bends the most. So if you look where the wood grain is, glue the craft sticks in the opposite direction, and I layered the craft sticks the whole way through the center of the wood round just to give it some extra security and to make it really stable so it wouldn't bend anymore like it did before. After I had all of the craft sticks glued on to the backside of one of the wood rounds, then I added a bunch more hot glue to the craft sticks and I laid the second wood round on top of it. You can paint or stain this any color you'd like. I took some antique wax and watered it down so that it would create a lighter color. Then using my wet wipes, I applied it to both sides of the wood round, and I also made sure that I got the edges covered in the wax as well. After my stain was nice and dry, I took my nautical rope and using some hot glue, I added the glue to the gap in between the two wood rounds, and I just started gluing my rope the whole way around. This gave it a nice finished look, and it covered up those raw edges of the two so that rather than looking like two wood rounds glued together, it just looked like one piece. To attach my candle container to the bottom of the wood round, I'm using a combination of this Fix-All adhesive. You can find this at the Dollar Tree. It's actually made by the Super Glue brand. And I'm also going to use some hot glue so that it holds right away. I added a few dabs of the Fix-All adhesive to the top of the container. Then in between those dabs of glue, I added a few dots of hot glue. I flipped it over and I put it in the center of the wood round. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Let me know in the comments if you have anything fun planned for Easter. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.